did not say about me when she introduced me is that I am also an award-winning liar. Out in the Northwest where I'm from, we have a contest up in Seattle every year with the Northwest Full Flag Festival. We have the annual Liars Contest, and I have won it 3 times. First place 3 times. My trophies are this big. So I wanted to share with you one of my award-winning lies. And like any good lie, it starts with the truth, which is that I have always wanted to be taller than 5'8". Yeah. My mother was 5'8", and I grew up to be 5'7". And you know how you, as a kid, you always want to be a little bit taller than your mother. And as an adult, I had kind of resigned myself to being only 5'8", 5'7", but oh, I wish I was taller than 5'8", but that's just the way it is. And then, in Portland, I met a fellow named John, who had a restaurant. John became a good friend. I got to know him first because he had a food cart. And you might have heard in Portland, we are crazy for food carts. We have them everywhere. And John had a soup food cart near the health division where I used to work. And I'd go there pretty much every lunch to get John's soup after I discovered it. It was so good. And then he got enough business that he decided to open a brick and mortar restaurant. And I was one of the first customers at his opening night. But in Portland, you might have heard this about us out in Portland. We are pretty particular about eating out in Portland. And we have vegans, and we have vegetarians, and we have vegetarian vegans, and we have carnivorous vegetarians, and we have glucose-free carnivorous vegans who only eat paleo on Sundays. So running a restaurant is a challenge. And John got to the point where he'd have these wonderful soups on the menu, but people would come in and say, well, now are there lentils in that? Or, you know, I just can't do the wheat germ. So he finally decided, you know, he had to change his approach. So he turned it into, he was a fan of the old fondue pot restaurants, and so he turned it into sort of that model. When you come in John's restaurant now, you sit at a table and there's a big pot of broth in the middle of the table, and you can choose vegetarian, chicken, or beef broth. And then you sit there, and then you go up to what looks like a salad bar, but it's really a soup ingredient bar, and you load your bowl with everything that you want to put in your soup. So you're making your own choice. He now calls the restaurant Soup de Yore. And so you load up your bowl, and then you come back to your pot of boiling broth. Now you do have to coordinate with your dining mates. You do have to have a certain amount of agreement because this is going to be a communal meal, but that usually works out. And then you all dump your bowls of ingredients in there, and you wait, and you sip whatever beverage you like to sip while your soup cooks, and then you have a bowl of soup. It is terrific. He's really taken off with it. But like any of you know, who either have your own business or perhaps are in the restaurant business, it is pretty much a 24-hour-a-day job, because when you're not in there working, you're either thinking about it or dreaming about it, or maybe trying not to think about it, but you're still thinking about it. So John was there late one night, as usual, prepping for the next day in the kitchen, and he needed something from the walk-in freezer. He went in to get it, door shut behind him, and when he turned to open it, the safety bar wouldn't release. And he'd gotten the equipment at auction, like you do when you're starting up a business, and he had been meaning to fix that jam because he knew it had a tendency to stick, but usually there's somebody else in the kitchen who could let you out. Well, he was alone in the kitchen that night because it was late. Even his girlfriend Martina had left him on his own because she was off at a friend's baby shower. So he's inside the walk-in freezer, and there may not be anybody there to let him in until the next morning. And at first he's trying not to get too unnerved about this, but then he feels all the hair in his body standing on end. And he remembers that is one of the first things that happens when hypothermia sets in, because your body's trying to trap all the air it can to keep you warm. And it's an odd feeling, he told me to have. John is a very furry person, as we say. He said it's a really odd feeling that all the hair on your back stand on end. Now, you can tell by the way I'm talking that John did survive this, so rest assured he survived, but it got close. So he started trying to keep himself warm. He jogged in place for a while, but it's a tiny little freezer. And then he ripped off the plastic curtains, the walking curtains, and wrapped them around himself for a little bit of insulation. But still, then he felt himself start to get drowsy. And that really worried him, because he knew that really meant hypothermia was seriously setting in. And he grabbed the handle of the door, and he said it was one of those situations where he could almost just see his life flashing in front of his eyes, and he's trying to open the door, and he rears back, and he pushes on the door and his feet slip and he conked his head right on the steel plate of the door, passed out, but by that time his hands were frozen to the bar. So when he passed out, he leaned backward, but he was still hanging on to the bar when he passed out. And it was lucky for him that Martina, his girlfriend, had gotten ticked off because he wasn't liking her Facebook posts. So she stormed into the restaurant, saw no John at the, saw vegetables chopped but no John at the cutting table, looked at the walk-in freezer, went over, opened the door, and John swung out. Hanging onto the bar, frozen in place. Well, Martina is a quick thinker, so she dialed 911 right away, got the ambulance on the way, and then she hurled herself around John, around his torso to, keep his midsection warm, because that's what you try to keep warm if you want to stop yourself from freezing to death. And Martina is pretty hot stuff. So she was holding him around the torso, and she kept him alive till the paramedics got there. And they didn't, if you have someone who's seriously been frozen, you can't just, plunk them in a tub of hot water immediately and warm them up, or there'll be tissue damage. So what they did is they used some hot cloths to get his hands unfrozen from the handlebar, and then they put him in the ambulance, and they took him up the hill to Oregon Health Sciences University, which is our big hospital up on the hill where they treat a lot of skiers who have this kind of thing happen to Mount Hood. So they're well versed in how to bring somebody back, and they put him in this special kind of, it's like a big plastic bag, but there's hot air in it, and they gradually increase the temperature, and your tissue gradually thaws out. And come to find out, the next morning, John was fine. He didn't even lose any fingers or toes, which was pretty miraculous. Martina was in there with him, and the only thing that seemed to be a little off is he was very clumsy. When he would reach for a glass of water, he'd knock it over, and when he tried to get the TV remote, he'd knock it off the bed. And John has pretty good reflexes, so we were like, but Martina decided, you've had a shock. It's probably just the shock, so let's not worry about it. And as soon as they released John, he wanted to get right back to work, because that's how he is. They went in the restaurant, he put on his chef's whites, he stepped up to the cutting table, grabbed his knife, started to chop an onion, and he just slammed that knife down on the cutting table. It was like, you know how it is when you step off a stair and you think you're at the last stair, but you're not, and you just have that feeling? He said that's what it felt like when the knife came down on the cutting board. And he dropped the knife and he held out his arms and said, what is going on? And Martina said, your hands. And they looked, well, the cuffs of his jacket were like a couple inches up on his arms. And he said, have you washed this? Did it shrink? She said, what if I had time to wash your jacket? And what they figured out is his arms had stretched from being in the freezer. So they took him back up to OHSU and they measured him. Now some of us may be familiar with the fact that your wingspan, what they call it when your arms are outside to side, is usually, for most of us, that's equivalent to our height, right? So your wingspan is usually what your height is. Well, John's wingspan was 2 inches longer than his height. Each arm had stretched an inch. And what they said at OHSU is it was a combination of the fact that his adrenaline was pumping because he thought he was about to die when he was, trying to get that open. And so there was all this adrenaline coursing through his body, so he had one of those superhuman, kind of stretch. He was stretched to the maximum, and then when he passed out and froze, it froze him in that maximum position. So the change was probably permanent. Well, they were a little taken aback by this, but they decided it wasn't life-altering. He just had to kind of step back a little bit from the cutting table to adjust himself. And Martina said she could put some kind of decorative rims around his chef's legs, so they didn't have to buy all new clothes. But Martina, who's a really, really good businesswoman, instantly saw the applications to her yoga practice. She's a yoga teacher, and what she started doing is bringing her students into the kitchen and getting them into pretty intense yoga positions right behind the stove where they'd be really hot. I don't know if you have hot yoga out here in Tennessee yet, but we have it in Portland. You literally get in a room and you sweat, which lets you get into positions that you couldn't get into when your body was in a sensible condition. And so what Martina did is she had these people behind the stove, she got them into the intense positions, stretching as more than they thought possible. Then she'd pop them on the serving cart, wheel them into the freezer, and just lightly freeze them. Just enough that when they came out, the change was pretty permanent. They could get into that position again with less and less trouble. Her business started booming. People were just lining up for this. hot and cold yoga. It sounded enough like hot and cold yogurt that people were like, yes, this sounds fun, I'm signing up for this. And then, there were a lot of young fellows who worked for John. And there is something, I don't know how it is here in Tennessee, but in Portland, there is something that almost every young fellow wants longer. Earlobes. In Portland, now we all wear earrings in Portland, men and women, and there's this fad among mostly young men to put a little button in their earlobe and then gradually increase the size of the button to stretch their earlobes out. I'm really not making this up. That really is actually true. And so, but usually it takes months because it's a very gradual thing. Well, these young guys figured out that if they went into the freezer and put a button in, they could stretch it and then added some fishing weights, to pull it out, and then again, lightly freeze themselves. They kind of helped themselves by lubricating the inside so they could make it in the freezer. And then come out, they could stretch their earlobes just in a matter of about a week. So, John's freezer was getting a lot of traffic. And then I said, John, I have always wanted to be taller. Gosh, I'd like to be taller than 5'8". He said, let's do it. So he helped me figure out, we experimented on a couple of chickens first. And we did like a little harness thing, and we suspended them, and they had little weights from their feet. And I am really glad we did, because the first chicken, we just managed to stretch its neck. So I would be standing here looking like, Alice in Wonderland in that phase if we had done that. Thank goodness we figured that out. But we figured out how to do a harness where you would stretch just the torso. Because I said to John, I kind of maybe a little bit of leg. I wouldn't mind if my legs were a little longer. Legs and torso, let's leave the neck as it is. So we figured out the mechanism. And then I got into the freezer in the torso, and John hung it from a meat hook, and the meat hook was on a chain, and he started to raise me up, and then he said, oh, wait a minute. Martina, can you take over here, because there's something I need to do. And so he went off where I couldn't see him, and Martina starts to raise me up, and then my feet are off the ground, and she anchors the chain, and then she puts a few weights around, and she's just about to leave me in the freezer when I think, oh, wait a minute, we didn't really talk about how I was going to get my adrenaline going, because I don't like the thought of being in the freezer by myself, but it's not, what are we didn't think that through. Just then the freezer door shut. Shoot. And then I heard something behind, he had like a half a side of beef hanging up, and I heard something behind it, and I looked over, and this white figure came out. It had a stocking mask on, and like white, but it was all smeared with blood, and this big carving knife came toward me, like raising this carving knife, and I just started to scream. I mean, I've seen those horror movies. Started to scream and try to get away, but I was trussed up like a chicken with my feet off, and I couldn't get away, and I'm screaming. It comes closer and closer, raising the knife, just gets right in front of me, and John takes the stocking mask off and starts to laugh, and then he said, that got your adrenaline going, didn't it? Thank you, John. Yes, it did. And so then I was all sweaty, which was nice, because I had to stay in the freezer for about half an hour. They got me out, untrusted me. I went out. They gradually thawed me out. When they measured me, ladies and gentlemen, I was 5 feet 8 inches and 3/4. I was 3/4 of an inch taller than my mother. I could not wait till the next family dinner. I went and lorded it over, Mom. Can I get that for you, Mom? Let me reach that for you. But I know this is kind of a fantastic story, and I don't expect you to take my word for it. So, with the help of Pat Smith, who's the wonderful woman who let you in today, our volunteer at the center, Pat has lent me a tape measure, and this is a tape measure that's been fully vetted. And I have invited Mr. Norm Brecky. Mr. Brecky, could you get him out of the soundproof room, please? Yes, here's Mr. Brecky. He's been in a soundproof room during the story. Mr. Brecky is from the National Institute of Measuring. He is a trained measurer, Mr. Brecky. Now, we've never met before?
No.
No. Yes. Thank you for agreeing to come out here. Now, Mr. Brecky, this is the measuring implement we have. Does it meet with your specifications? All right, thank you. So now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brecky will officially measure me.
No tiptoes.
No tiptoes.
5'8" and 3/4.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.